Dylan Jordan wasn't the kind of person who just disappeared. That's what his family said when the police first arrived at their door, notebooks in hand, asking the usual questions. No, he didn't have a history of running off. No, he wasn't mixed up in anything dangerous. No, he didn't have enemies. Dylan was reliable, predictable, a creature of habit. He woke up at the same time every morning, made his coffee the same way, left his house at precisely 6:45 a.m. for his 30-minute commute to work. His routine was clockwork, down to the moment he parked his car and walked into the office. But on March 17th, something broke that routine. Dylan left for work at 6:45 a.m., just as he always did. He pulled out of his driveway, his car moving down the quiet, suburban street. Security cameras in the neighborhood captured it. His silver Honda Civic passing through an intersection, nothing unusual. Then, somewhere along the 18-mile drive between his house and his office, Dylan Jordan disappeared. No traffic stops, no phone calls, no distress signals, just gone. First, nobody noticed. His 9 a.m. meeting went on without him. His coworkers assumed he was running late, maybe stuck in traffic. His phone went straight to voicemail, but that wasn't a red flag. Maybe his battery had died. By noon, the concerns grew louder. His boss called his wife. His wife called his sister. His sister called everyone she could think of. By 5 p.m., Dylan Jordan was officially a missing person. The first real break in the case came at 7:20 p.m., when a jogger spotted an abandoned car parked near a remote trailhead just off the highway, nearly 10 miles away from Dylan's workplace. It was his Honda Civic. The engine was off. The driver's side door was shut. The car wasn't locked, but nothing seemed disturbed. His wallet was inside, along with his phone, lying face up on the passenger seat. The screen was cracked, but still functioning. There were no signs of a struggle, just an ordinary car, parked in an unusual place, with its owner nowhere to be found. At first glance, investigators saw no evidence of foul play, but something about the scene didn't add up. Dylan had no reason to be at that trailhead. He wasn't a hiker. He had never mentioned going there before. His GPS history didn't show previous visits. Even stranger, his phone history revealed something unsettling. At 6:55 a.m., just 10 minutes after he left home, his phone pinged off a cell tower far outside his usual route. At 7:02 a.m., a mysterious text was sent from his number to an unknown contact. At 7:07 a.m., his phone went dark. No calls, no texts, no location updates. It was as if, in the span of 22 minutes, Dylan Jordan had been erased. The police dug deeper, retracing his steps, interviewing witnesses, checking cameras. They expected the usual patterns, surveillance footage showing him turning onto the main highway, maybe stopping for gas or coffee. But what they found was nothing. Dylan's car was never seen again after leaving his neighborhood. No gas station footage. No street cameras picking up his plates. No toll booth records. It was as if his car had vanished from the road itself. Then the case took an even darker turn. Because when investigators dug into the last person who contacted Dylan before he vanished, they discovered something deeply unsettling. Someone had lied. According to Dylan's phone records, his last outgoing call was made at 6:52 a.m., just 7 minutes after he left his house. The call lasted 46 seconds. The person on the other end? His coworker, Evan Carter. Evan was one of Dylan's closest friends at the office. But when police questioned him, he seemed off. At first, he claimed he hadn't spoken to Dylan that morning, that he only realized Dylan was missing when their boss sent out a message. But the records proved otherwise. When confronted, Evan changed his story. He admitted that Dylan had called him but insisted it was nothing important, just a quick chat before work. Then police noticed something else. Evan Carter's phone pinged off the same remote cell tower Dylan's phone had. At the same time, why was Evan miles away from where he should have been at the exact moment Dylan vanished? More importantly, why did he lie about it? When investigators pressed him for answers, Evan shut down the interview. He refused to speak without a lawyer. But it was too late. The police had their first real lead. By the time the news of Dylan's disappearance spread, his family was desperate for answers. His wife, Emma, pleaded for help, her voice shaking during interviews. His sister, Claire, combed through his social media, looking for any clue he might have left behind. But then, something chilling happened. 2 days after Dylan vanished, Emma received a text message. Came from Dylan's number. It was short, just 3 words. Don't look back. And then, just like his phone, the number went dark. The message was traced. Authorities tried to pinpoint its origin, but the results were impossible. Dylan's phone had never been turned back on after 7:07 a.m. on the day he disappeared. Someone or something had sent that message from an untraceable source. And the case of Dylan Jordan had just become something much worse than a missing persons case. The deeper the police dug, the stranger Dylan's case became. His co-worker's alibi started falling apart. More witnesses came forward with unsettling accounts. And then, the authorities received a final piece of evidence that changed everything. What really happened to Dylan Jordan? Dylan Jordan had been missing for 48 hours. The police had his car, his phone records, and a co-worker with a shaky alibi. But they still had no body, no clear motive, and no solid evidence pointing to what had really happened. Then, on the morning of March 19th, a call came in. A woman had been walking her dog 2 miles from where Dylan's car was found. She had taken her usual route, a dirt trail that cut through thick trees and led to a clearing near the Red River Gorge. That morning, something stopped her in her tracks. A shoe, sitting in the middle of the path, perfectly clean, untouched by dirt or rain. She picked it up, turning it over in her hands. It was a men's dress shoe, the kind someone would wear to the office. The brand? Cole Haan, the same brand Dylan Jordan wore every day. She looked around. The woods were silent. No rustling leaves. No animals scurrying in the underbrush. Just the shoe, sitting there like it had been placed on purpose. She felt a chill and backed away, pulling her dog along as she hurried back to her car. Within an hour, the police were on the scene. They searched the area, and that's when they found something else. The woods near the Red River Gorge were dense and unforgiving. It was the kind of place where a person could walk a few hundred yards in and disappear without a trace. The search team spread out, scouring the area where the shoe had been found. Then, about 20 yards deeper into the woods, they saw it. A second shoe. Same brand, same size, left behind. Then, 10 yards beyond that, a torn piece of fabric. Investigators knelt down, carefully lifting it from the undergrowth. It was a strip of dark gray suit fabric, and Dylan had been wearing a gray suit on the morning he vanished. Suddenly, the case was no longer just a missing persons case. Someone had been here. Someone had left these clues behind. And then, the investigation took a turn no one expected, because when they analyzed Dylan's phone, they found something disturbing. The message Emma Jordan received, "Don't look back," had been sent from Dylan's phone number. But after running forensic tests, authorities confirmed something chilling. Dylan's phone had never been turned back on after he vanished, which meant that message was either scheduled before he disappeared, or someone had access to his number remotely. It got worse. They extracted the last text Dylan sent before his phone shut off. It was sent at 7:02 a.m., 5 minutes before he vanished from the grid. The recipient, a burner phone, and the message, just one word: help. With the discovery of the burner phone, the police circled back to Evan Carter, Dylan's co-worker and the last person he called. First, Evan stuck to his story, but then investigators uncovered something shocking. On the morning Dylan disappeared, Evan's own phone pinged off the same remote tower as Dylan's at 6:55 a.m., a full 25 miles away from where Evan claimed he was at the time. When police confronted him with this information, Evan's face went pale. He hesitated, shifted in his seat, then said something that made the lead detective's blood run cold. "I can't talk about it. I'll get in trouble." The police searched Evan Carter's financial records, looking for anything unusual in the days leading up to Dylan's disappearance. They found a single transaction that stood out: a hotel room booked in cash 2 nights before Dylan vanished, at a rundown roadside motel less than 2 miles from where Dylan's car was found. The room was checked out under a fake name, but security footage confirmed it. At 9:48 p.m. on March 15th, 2 days before Dylan disappeared, Evan Carter entered that hotel room, and he wasn't alone. He was with Dylan Jordan. Investigators pored over the security footage from the hotel. The timestamps showed the two men checking in together. At 11:17 p.m., the footage showed Dylan exiting the room, alone. He stood outside for a moment, looking around, his hands in his pockets. Then, at 11:23 p.m., he got into his car and drove away. That was the last time he was seen on camera before he vanished. So why had Evan lied about seeing him that night? What had happened inside that hotel room? And most importantly, who else knew about it? Because 48 hours later, Dylan Jordan was gone. And the next major discovery would prove that whatever had happened, he had never been alone that morning. Dylan's last moments before he vanished were starting to take shape. His coworker knew more than he let on. There was a mystery phone, and most disturbingly, surveillance footage from a traffic camera had just surfaced, and it showed something that changed everything. The disappearance of Dylan Jordan had just taken a terrifying turn. The hotel footage had confirmed something troubling. Dylan had been somewhere he wasn't supposed to be just 2 days before he vanished. His coworker Evan Carter had lied, and now a trail of evidence. His shoes, his torn clothing, his final text message suggested he had been taken somewhere against his will. But police still didn't know how it had happened, until they found the traffic camera footage. It had been recorded at 7:05 a.m. on March 17th, just 3 minutes after Dylan's last phone ping. The camera sat at a lonely intersection on the outskirts of town. It wasn't the best angle, and at first glance, the footage looked normal, just a few cars passing through on their way to work. But then, at exactly 7:05 a.m., a dark-colored SUV rolled into the frame, and inside, sitting rigid in the passenger seat, his head turned sharply toward the window, his expression frozen, was Dylan Jordan. The SUV was a late-model black Chevrolet Tahoe with no front license plate. Dylan's face was clearly visible in the footage, but what stood out most wasn't just that he was in the vehicle. It was the way he looked. His mouth was slightly open, his posture stiff. His right hand was pressed against the passenger side window, fingers barely curled, as if he had tried to tap the glass, as if he had been about to signal for help. But before the camera could capture more details, the SUV disappeared down the road. Investigators enhanced the footage, zooming in on the driver's seat. But the tinted windows and the sun's glare made it nearly impossible to identify the person behind the wheel. What they could see, however, was something unsettling. The driver was wearing gloves. Thick, black gloves. The kind meant to hide fingerprints. And just before the SUV left the frame, the driver's hand lifted slightly, and for half a second, their fingers curled into a tight fist, as if they were sending a silent message. To who? At this point, Evan Carter had lied to police, his alibi had fallen apart, and now, Dylan had been seen in a vehicle that wasn't his own. Authorities knew they had to act fast. They obtained a search warrant for Evan's home. First, nothing stood out. His house was neatly kept. No signs of struggle, no obvious traces of Dylan's belongings. But then they entered his garage, and inside they found something that stopped them cold. A black Chevrolet Tahoe, a perfect match to the one Dylan had last been seen in. The SUV was covered in a thin layer of dust, as if it hadn't been driven in days. The police opened the driver's side door, scanning the interior. That's when they saw it. On the passenger seat, wedged between the cushion and the door frame, was a single gold cufflink. And not just any cufflink. One that matched the set Dylan Jordan wore every day to work. Investigators moved fast, dusting the interior for prints. But what they found made no sense. Because aside from Evan Carter's fingerprints on the steering wheel, there were none. Not a single print from Dylan Jordan. Not on the seatbelt. Not on the door handle. As if he had never touched anything inside that car. Just when police thought they were closing in on how Dylan had disappeared, something strange happened. They reviewed the security footage from Evan Carter's neighborhood. hoping to place him in the SUV on the morning of March 17th. But there was a problem. The vehicle had never left the garage that morning. According to the time-stamped footage, Evan had driven a completely different car to work, his usual silver sedan. So if the black Tahoe never left the garage, how had Dylan been seen inside that exact same vehicle just 2 miles away? One theory began to take shape. What if the SUV in the traffic footage wasn't Evan's at all? What if someone else, someone who knew Dylan well, had been driving an identical car? Someone who wanted to throw the investigation off course? And if that was the case, where was Dylan really taken that morning? Because right as investigators began piecing the timeline together, something shocking happened. Someone used Dylan Jordan's bank card, and they used it 3 states away. The transaction took place at a gas station in Missouri, more than 500 miles from where Dylan vanished. Security footage showed a man in a baseball cap and dark hoodie approaching the ATM. He kept his head down, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. He inserted a card, waited, pulled out $500 in cash, and just before walking away, he glanced up at the camera. The footage was grainy, the hood's shadow casting a dark veil over his face. But one detail stood out: his jawline. It was the same shape, the same sharp edge, the same structure as Dylan Jordan's. The resemblance was unmistakable. So the question was, had Dylan somehow escaped and fled to another state? Or was someone using his identity for something far worse? Everything about the case had changed. There was no clear suspect, no logical explanation for the duplicate SUV. And now, a man who looked identical to Dylan Jordan had just pulled cash from his bank account half a country away. But before police could process what it meant, they got a new lead. A motel in Kansas had just reported a disturbance in one of its rooms. The guest inside? A man who checked in under the name Dylan Jordan. And when hotel staff knocked on his door, asking if everything was all right, a low voice from inside the room responded, "Go away." But the voice? It didn't sound like Dylan's at all. Dylan Jordan's case had just taken a bizarre and terrifying twist. A duplicate SUV, a mystery ATM transaction, and now someone using his name in a motel room states away. The Missouri ATM footage had already thrown the investigation into chaos. The man using Dylan Jordan's bank card looked almost identical to him. Same jawline, same height, same build. But something was off. Now, a motel in Kansas, over 100 miles away from the ATM transaction, had reported something disturbing. A man checked in under Dylan Jordan's name, and when staff knocked on his door, the voice that answered wasn't Dylan's. Authorities moved fast. By the time they arrived, the motel was nearly empty. Just a handful of travelers, the flickering neon sign buzzing faintly overhead. The manager led them to room 214. The door was locked. They knocked. No answer. But inside, there was movement. Slow, deliberate movement. Then silence. And in that silence, something felt deeply wrong. So they didn't wait. They kicked the door open. And what they found inside would change everything. The room was small and stale. A dim yellow lamp, a bed with the sheets pulled tight, a battered suitcase in the corner. And in the middle of it all, a man. He stood near the window, his back to the officers. His broad shoulders tensed, his hands curled into loose fists. Something about his posture froze the entire room. "Turn around," an officer ordered. The man hesitated. Then slowly he turned, and the sight of his face sent a chill through every officer in that room. Because he wasn't just similar to Dylan Jordan. He was identical, down to every last feature. But this man, whoever he was, didn't look surprised to see them. He didn't even look scared. He just smiled. A cold, knowing smile. And that's when they saw it. The long, fresh scratch marks running down his forearm. They handcuffed the man immediately. He didn't resist, didn't even ask why. But when they checked his wallet, the ID inside read, Dylan Jordan. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. This man looked like Dylan. Had Dylan's ID, Dylan's bank card, Dylan's name on the motel registry. But something was deeply wrong. They had footage of Dylan being taken against his will. They had his last phone ping near that strange hotel. So how was he standing right here, calmly watching them as if nothing had happened? The officers asked him one simple question. Who are you? And the man's smile widened. Then, in a low, calm voice, he said, I told you, I'm Dylan Jordan. Back at the station, things got even stranger. The man refused to provide any information other than his name. Where have you been the past few days? I told you, I was here. Who were you with? No one. Every answer was calm, flat, unshaken. But detectives noticed something strange. For someone who claimed to be Dylan Jordan, he couldn't answer basic questions about Dylan's life. What's your mother's name? Silence. Where do you work? Pause. Then, I don't know. And that's when detectives realized something chilling. This man wasn't Dylan Jordan, but he thought he was. A DNA test was rushed through. The results came back faster than anyone expected. And when they did, the entire investigation turned upside down. Because the DNA wasn't a match. This man, who had Dylan's face, Dylan's bank card, Dylan's ID, was not Dylan Jordan. So if this wasn't Dylan, where was the real Dylan Jordan? And more importantly, who was this man? Before investigators could figure out what to do next, something terrifying happened. The motel called the station. Their cleaning crew had just found something disturbing in room 214. Something they hadn't seen earlier. Something wedged deep beneath the bed frame. Officers returned to the room immediately. They lifted the mattress, pulled back the sheets, crawled under the frame, and that's when they saw it. A crumpled up piece of clothing. A shirt. And not just any shirt. The same white button-down Dylan Jordan had been wearing the day he disappeared. It was ripped down the middle and covered in dark, dried blood. The sight of it sent a jolt of panic through the officers. Because if this was Dylan's shirt, that meant the real Dylan Jordan had been in this room. But when? And was he still alive? Forensics rushed to test the blood. And the results only deepened the mystery. Because the DNA wasn't just Dylan's. It belonged to two different people. One was Dylan Jordan, but the other was an unknown male. Everything about the case had taken a terrifying new direction. A man identical to Dylan Jordan had been living under his identity. Dylan's blood-stained shirt had just been found hidden in a motel room, and now there was evidence of a second unknown person involved. But before police could even begin to untangle what was happening, the man in custody, the one claiming to be Dylan Jordan, did something no one expected. In the middle of the night, he vanished from his holding cell. No signs of forced escape. No unlocked doors. He was just gone. And that's when the phone rang. A gas station clerk, this time in Colorado, had just seen something disturbing. A man staggering into the store. A man covered in dried blood, barely able to stand. A man who, when asked his name, whispered one thing. My name is Dylan Jordan, and I need help. Dylan Jordan was alive. But what had happened to him? Who was the imposter? And how did he escape from police custody without a trace? When the phone rang at the station, every officer in the room froze. The caller ID read, Arapahoe County Sheriff's Office, Colorado. It was over 400 miles away from where the case had started. And the voice on the other end delivered news that sent a shockwave through the investigation. They had just found Dylan Jordan, the real Dylan Jordan. Authorities in Aurora, Colorado, had been called to a 24-hour gas station after a clerk reported something disturbing. A man staggered in from the darkness. His clothes were torn and blood-stained. His face was gaunt, hollow, like someone who had been running for days. And when he collapsed at the counter, his voice was barely a whisper. My name is Dylan Jordan. I need help. The clerk called 911 immediately. When paramedics arrived, Dylan was on the verge of passing out. His hands shook uncontrollably. His lips were cracked and dry. He had marks around his wrists, as if he had been bound for days. And in a weak, strained voice, he muttered something that made no sense. He took my life. It took nearly 12 hours for Dylan to be stable enough to speak clearly. And when he finally did, his story was beyond anything investigators expected. It all started the morning he disappeared. He left for work. He got in his car. And then, Everything went black. When he woke up, he was somewhere cold, somewhere dark. His hands and feet were tied. His head pounded like he had been drugged. And then he saw him, the man standing in the doorway, a man with his exact face. And in that moment, Dylan realized the terrifying truth. He was staring at himself. The man never gave his name, never said where they were, but Dylan remembered his voice. Low, controlled, completely emotionless. "You don't exist anymore," the man had said. Then he took Dylan's wallet, his ID, his keys, his phone, and walked out the door. Dylan was left behind in the darkness, unable to move, unable to scream. For days he was trapped. No food, barely any water. The only sound was the drip of a leaking pipe somewhere in the distance. And the only thing running through his mind was the question, who was that man? Dylan only survived because of one mistake. At some point, the man slipped up, left the ropes a little looser than before. Dylan worked for hours to free himself. When he finally broke free, he stumbled through the darkness, searching for a way out. The room he had been kept in was part of an abandoned building, an old industrial warehouse. He pushed through a rusted door and found himself standing in the middle of nowhere. The Colorado wilderness stretched in every direction. No roads, no lights, nothing. Dylan started walking. He had no idea how long, only that his legs burned, his throat ached, and his vision blurred. But he didn't stop. Not until he saw the faint glow of the gas station sign in the distance. And now here he was, barely alive, but alive. Authorities now had two urgent questions. Who was the man pretending to be Dylan Jordan? How did he escape from custody? They rushed back to the Missouri jail where the imposter had been held. And what they found was terrifying. Surveillance footage from inside the cell showed something impossible. At 2:47 a.m., the man had been sitting on the edge of his cot. He was completely still, silent, watching. Then suddenly, he stood up and walked toward the door, not in a rush, not trying to force his way out, just walking. And the second he reached the door, the footage glitched. For exactly 10 seconds, the screen was static. And when it cleared again, the man was gone. No sign of how he left. No evidence of tampering. He had simply vanished. And now he was out there, walking around with Dylan Jordan's face. Investigators searched for months. They checked hospitals, surveillance cameras, abandoned motels. But there was no trace of the imposter. It was as if he had never existed. But then, one final clue surfaced. A DNA analysis of the blood on Dylan's shirt came back. The second DNA profile was a partial match to Dylan Jordan himself. Not a sibling, not a cousin, something even stranger. An identical genetic match with slight anomalies. Something that shouldn't be possible. And the experts had only one explanation. Whoever that man was, he wasn't just a look-alike. He was, in a way, Dylan Jordan. Dylan Jordan eventually recovered. But he never felt safe again. Because somewhere out there, a man with his face, his DNA, his identity, was still walking free. And the question still lingers. Was it a case of stolen identity? Or was there something much darker at play? To this day, the imposter has never been found. And Dylan Jordan's case remains one of the strangest unsolved disappearances in modern history.